Hello. I want to say good morning. It's barely still morning where I am. 11:33 a.m. where I am on the west coast of Northern California. So welcome into this space wherever you are joining from in this moment. Whether you're live or watching the replay, I always love it if you're willing to just say, where are you joining from? And that way we get a sense of where, how in space and time are we connected in this wider web of connection that the internet, that Facebook, that other apps sort of give us access to the connection that's actually always already there, but it's always lovely to know where are you actually joining from. And as always, before I dive in, just a reminder that I love the engagement. So any questions you have, any comments, any shares about your life, absolutely welcome them. If you're watching the replay, you can just let me know you're in the replay and still bring all your questions, your comments, your shares. Insofar as this medium can be a dialogue, I love for it to be a dialogue. Let's dive in. So there's a lot of reasons why I believe that it's valuable to distinguish between what is sensual, what is pleasurable or what is pleasure, what is sexual, and what is erotic. And more so than just to define so that we know, but to actually engage with how do these live in our, how do we live them, or how do these actually come in our lived life? How do we experience them? Not so much as to say like this is this and this is this and put things in boxes, but to actually give us places to explore and express. I believe we are all sensual beings. We all have the capacity, and I would say the birthright, to experience pleasure. We are all sexual beings in some way, shape, or form. And we all have the capacity to experience and tap into the erotic experience. And all of these are deeply, deeply nourishing for human beings, and perhaps for some of the more than human realm, but I don't know. So I'm going to speak from the human experience, but to be engaged in the sensual realm is deeply nourishing. And I would say essential. I would actually say all of these are essential, and that we actually deprive ourselves of the full nourishment of each of these. We deprive ourselves of the full nourishment of the sensual, of the pleasurable, of the sexual, and of the erotic when we map them over unconsciously. So absolutely all four of these are threads that weave together that sometimes are the same experience or act, but sometimes are different. And so in order, it's like be like Thanksgiving dinner and just making it all one thing. Thanksgiving dinner, right? You know, mashed potatoes, turkey, gravy, stuffing, that green lime jello situation that some people's families like. And like, that's just all one thing. It all happens at once. There's no differentiating, but that actually being able to go like, oh, this is the turkey and this is, and I choose to put gravy on my turkey, but they're not the same thing. It's a different experience when I eat turkey without the gravy, or when I have mashed potatoes mixed with my stuffing. And in that way, we actually get to be more nourished by each individual piece in some way. So the sensual, the pleasurable, the sexual, and the erotic. So I'm going to do a little bit of distinguishing first, and then I want to talk about I mean, I already in talking about how we can be nourished, that's part of why I think it's valuable to distinguish. I actually think that then we have more capacity to be more deeply nourished in this, but to look at like, why is it important to distinguish these? So sensual. Sensual is what I would call having to do with the senses. So often, I mean, if we think about it, we all know this if we bring it into consciousness, but often we'll only think about the sensual as touch, our sense of touch, like a sensual, silk sheets or something, right? That's sensual. But sensual is, I mean, it sounds a little definition-y, and it might say this in the dictionary. I don't actually know. I did not look it up. These are my own distinctions based on definitions, based on my own experience with myself and with people I work with. But sensual is of or having to do with the senses. And I would include even in that what many of us call the sixth sense. But let's go with the 5 tangible senses that we all know we all have, right? So our sense of touch, our sense of sight, our sense of smell, our sense of taste, and our sense of hearing. So any way in which we engage one or more of our senses is what I would call sensual. And so, sometimes you'll see out there this idea of sensual living. And I'm totally in favor of that. And I think it really is a thing. And often that gets mapped over to pleasurable. So I want to distinguish that you can have a sense, you can be engaged in the sensual, in the realm of taste, and have it be something that you don't like. It's still actually a sensual, a sensory experience. You can have, one of my kittens likes to do this thing. Like I'm really happy if she's on my lap, but she likes to like crawl up and then start like scratching at my neck. And it is it's a sensual experience of her claws on my neck, and I don't like it. It's not pleasurable. Especially with the sense of sound, I would also encourage remembering that silence itself is also a sensual experience and can be deeply pleasurable or deeply nourishing. So I would say, so again, the sense of smell, we can smell something that we don't like. But to engage with our sense of taste, our sense of smell, our sense of hearing, touch, and to actually be aware of those senses, that is what I would call sensual living. And that is what is of the sensual. So it can be something that's pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, right? All the way to pleasurable. And I really like it too, like not my favorite, but it's happening. But they're all sensual experiences. And our willingness or our capacity to take time to actually experience them more consciously. So we're kind of always receiving in all of our senses. And for good reason, honestly, our brain blocks some out some of the time because we'd be overwhelmed. So there's processes that happen in our brain that are determining which are the most important, which are the most valuable, which ones should this being pay attention to right now. And humans are, very oriented by our sense of sight. So often that's what we're most oriented to is like, what can I see? Some of that is, danger, this, that, and the other. But actually choosing, and we can do this in a lot of ways. I mean, this is why blindfold is sort of this like sensual thing, or it's why it gets included in those realms is because it heightens the other senses. Because as humans, we're so connected to our sense of sight. And so to remove that means like, my hearing suddenly comes on. I can hear if someone's walking towards me without seeing them, or I can tell where am I, or it might heighten the sense of touch because I'm not also distracted by what I can see or what I can smell, these kinds of things. So playing with removing any of our senses, some of them we may or may not really have the capacity to do. to do that, but in whatever way we can remove some of our senses can heighten the other ones, and that can bring our conscious awareness, but also just our intention, right? Oh, I'm gonna focus less on what I can hear, and in this moment focus on what I can taste, which actually is always available, whether we have like food or drink in our mouth, or it's just the like actually the taste in our mouth, which again can be pleasurable or not pleasurable. But there's some sense there. There's pretty much always actually a sense of touch, even if nothing is touching me or I'm not touching myself. My clothes are touching my body. The air itself, again, sometimes we can feel the breeze is a more obvious sense of the air touching us, but even just, is it cool or is it hot? Is there air moving or not air moving? Is right, that's some sensory in the sense of touch experience. What can I hear, right? And again, it can be pleasant or not pleasant, but it is a sensual experience. Hearing a car, like car tires, like skidding around a corner, sensual, like auditory sensual experience, but maybe or maybe not pleasurable. And again, these things can go into the sexual, which I'll get into, but like maybe that's a turn on for someone, right? Hearing like tires screeching around a corner, like it's like, oh, titillating, actually becomes a sexual experience. Although it still may not be exactly pleasurable, right? Like some people enjoy pain and they may experience it as pleasure, but they may not experience it as pleasure, but it's sensual and it might also be sexual. So there's where do these things actually meet for us, and getting more specific about the kind of experience we are having and the kind of experience we want to be having. So when you tune in with your ears, most of you probably can hear my voice right now, but if I'm silent for a moment, you might be able to hear my kid in the background on his classroom Zoom call if I'm that quiet. I don't know how well this is picked up, or maybe you are in a city and you heard a lot of bustling, and you can start to distinguish what is vehicles, what is people. Maybe you heard birds. Maybe, and again, this is true also with our sense of our sensory. Like it's not just touch; it's actually just what is our physical sensation. That is a sensual or sensory experience, internal and external. That sometimes is like, yeah, I didn't hear anything, or oh, I don't feel anything there. That is actually one of our sensory or sensual experiences. Silence itself, or an area of our body where we say, I don't have any sensation there. Number one, that's often not true. If we actually put our attention, we find something. But even if it is numbness itself, or sort of a void of what we would call sensual experience there, that is in and of itself an actual sensory or sensual experience. So again, sensual, rather than mapping that over, first of all, when we hear the word sensual, we tend to think of it as pleasurable, something we like, oh yeah, like sensual, it's like yummy and gooey, and that's just one realm of sensual. Going like, oh, this is the sensory or sensual experience I am having. Do I like it or not like it? What parts do I like? What parts do I not like? What would I like more? And whether it's all something we like or something we would call pleasurable, I do believe that we are more nourished, and our lives are richer actually by expanding and recognizing like, oh, right, that sensual, I just took a breath and my shirt moved on my belly, right? Like, oh yeah, most of the time I wouldn't notice that as a sensory or sensual experience, but it is happening. So it enriches our lives to take some time to slow down, to bring our awareness to what our sensual experience is, regardless of whether we call it pleasurable or not pleasurable. So pleasurable, let's go to pleasure. So that's an experience that you like, right? A touch can be pleasurable. A sound can be pleasurable. It's something I like. It brings me pleasure. I can see something that I find delightful or beautiful or appealing to my senses. So, and again, it's visual, but it's not just to my eyes. Like there's some, it's like, that's just appealing to me in some way. Maybe it's a texture and there's something rich about it, but without even touching it, I can have an experience that it is pleasing to me. And maybe I touch it and it's really soft and that's also pleasing to me. But these are not inherently sexual. So my own touch on myself can be sexual and it can be pleasurable. It's always going to be a sensual or sensory experience because I'm having it. But it can be pleasurable. I can touch myself in a way that I like, or something that actually I don't like or doesn't feel good, or another person can touch me in that way, or I can hear something, or I can smell a rose, right? Or smelling a rose is a sensual experience that I would say is not inherently sexual. It can be. What is this? There's this term ecosexual, right? Like to be turned on by the natural world. I totally feel that way, but not all the time. I mean, that's the thing is I'm turned on by humans, but I'm not turned on by every human. So my daughter coming and snuggling into my lap is a sensual experience and it is a pleasurable experience. It feels good and it's not sexual. And so there's that capacity to be turned on by the natural world and to have experiences with the natural world, like hugging a tree or smelling a rose or putting my hands in the dirt that might be sensual and might be pleasurable and may or may not be sexual. And when we allow for that, when we allow ourselves to have sensual experiences that are or are not pleasurable, to have pleasurable experiences that are or are not sexual, we expand the range of what we can experience without it's almost like we unconsciously bypass many of those experiences and don't allow them to be nourishing and rich because they don't fit into what we think of. Pleasure, if we're having pleasure, it's sexual. Or if it's sexual, it's pleasurable, right? I mean, I think most of us know that we can also have a sexual experience that's not pleasurable. Totally possible. And I remember, this actually comes back to me quite often. And I don't remember what she was referring to, but a colleague of mine named Marsha Baczynski, who does more work specifically in the realm of sexuality, was telling me about a book she read where the author said, we are allowed to have unpleasant sexual experiences. And it really stuck with me, this idea that, of course, we want to have consensual sexual experiences, but that all sexual experiences actually don't have to be good. And we're allowed to be in the wider realm in that way and go like, oh, without maybe always making such a thing like, oh, that meant something was wrong with me or something was wrong with them or, da, 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 da. It's just like, oh, I had a sexual experience. I didn't like it. And maybe it's just one part. Maybe it's the whole thing, but often it's just like, yeah, I didn't like that part. So this realm of allowing that a sexual experience itself can be pleasant or unpleasant, pleasurable or unpleasurable. It can be neutral. But they are in the realm of the sensual. Like my son right now is making a really unpleasant sound with his voice. It's not pleasurable to my ears at all. I don't know why he's making that sound. I hope you all can't hear it. And part of why I think this is important, so what I want to say about the erotic, and I'm not going to get deeply into the erotic. I think that there are people who have taught a lot about this. I think of the erotic in some way as and one level as that which is the creative force of the universe, like that is the erotic force of the universe. But I also think of the erotic as something that encompasses all three, sensual, pleasurable, and sexual. But I don't know if I totally believe that. That was something that I was coming onto this. I was like, I wonder if that's how I would define the erotic. I think for me, the erotic, as I looked at the dictionary definition, and it specifically said relating to or tending to arousal, sexual desire, or excitement. But it does say or. So I'm going to stick with kind of my first definition, which is for me, the erotic is actually the life energy, or the creative. Let's call it creative, because life, we tend to get really limited in our definition of what is alive or what does life mean. So I would call erotic the creative energy of the universe. And that is related to the sensual, it's related to the pleasurable, it's related to the sexual, but it's really its own thing. So that sort of might require its own whole piece on the erotic. But I want to say, beyond simply where we can allow ourselves to be more enriched and more nourished and to have a richer experience of life, when we distinguish like, oh, these are the sensual experiences, and they're not limited to touch. Or sometimes food, we'll let food be sensual. So it's like this taste, it's something we indulge in. But we don't always think about, with our sense of sound, how can I allowing for the sound to come in and be a sensual experience. I was up near Mount Shasta recently, and the sound of the wind would come through the trees, and it was like a deeply pleasurable experience. Did not feel sexual to me. But in it, I felt connected to the erotic. So that's my personal experience of that. But where we can enrich our sensual experience of life by, what am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I seeing? And the broader sense of actually, what am I taking in with my eyes? But I also think it matters to distinguish these because, first of all, most of them get lumped into the realm of sexual. Most of us, if we hear the word sensual, we link it. We don't necessarily think it means sex per se, but there's something that we unconsciously go like, sexual. If we're going to talk sensual or, we're like sexual. And we might kind of go into that like that's titillating. And we're like, yeah, the sensual is sexual. But we've eliminated all these other realms of sensual. Or we'll start to dismiss it. Like oftentimes also like, I can't be in my sensual experience because that's sexual and that's inappropriate or that's unsafe or all these different things, rather than like, what is the sensual experience? Which again, might not even be pleasurable. It just is. Sometimes it just is, right? We could call that neutral or just what's so. And then also what are the sensual experiences I'm having right now that are on the realm of pleasurable, right? Like the spectrum, like all the way to like very pleasurable to very unpleasurable or unpleasant. And for each of us, that's going to be different, right? Because all the way over here actually might be pain for somebody, but that's also deeply pleasurable. Those might be on the same end of the spectrum or sometimes. So, but I do believe that it's important for most of us to distinguish this from sexual specifically in order to allow ourselves to have more sensual and more pleasurable experiences that are not necessarily sexual. So in most of the spaces that I hold or programs I run, especially for women, but not always just for women, we'll talk about a pleasure practice. And almost always people think that means like a solo sexual practice or a masturbation practice. So just a little note here. First of all, solo sexual practice does not necessarily mean masturbation either. Because most people think masturbation means like touching your actual genitals. So none of these things have to mean these things. But part of what I think is important is like that these ideas get thrown around like a pleasure practice. And then we go like, okay, first of all, that means sexual. And okay, that means like touching the parts of my body that are sexual. And even that means touching myself, rather than what actually is pleasurable. Is eating an ice cream cone pleasurable? Might that also feel sexual? Absolutely. Is it inherently sexual? No. And so there are pleasure practices that are specifically related to touch. There are pleasure practices that have to do with following the impulse of pleasure, whether that leads to touch, whether that leads to our senses and finding what is sensually pleasurable, whether that follows the impulse to an ice cream cone, whether that includes stillness or movement, but it expands our possibilities around what what is a sensual practice, what is a pleasure practice, and what is a sexual practice. And allowing for these not to be the same thing gives us the opportunity to titrate for ourselves around feeling more in our lives. Especially if or when we may have had some trauma, and I would say most of us have. Again, it's a spectrum all the way from what we might call severe trauma to what we wouldn't necessarily label as severe trauma. But the sensual practice around the sensual is automatically an invitation to be more in our physical experience. So many of us who've had some form of trauma will have some dissociative process. And the invitation, rather than, what gets lumped together, like the sensual is sexual and going straight for something intense in that way, and then not being able to stay connected to our own body, our own sensory or visceral experience, we lose that rather than, oh, but can I actually just stay connected to what I hear? And that actually is inherently an invitation to be more in my body, because my hearing is a sensory experience. And it's actually happening within, it's happening because I have a body, because I'm in my body. What do I see is an invitation into my body. And yes, what do I feel? But again, rather than making it sexual, just what does this feel like? Is this pleasurable or not pleasurable? Even just staying in that realm is an invitation to be in one's body and the actual experience. And again, rather than assuming like, oh, if I touch my nipples, it should feel good, but asking ourselves the question, if I touch myself here, does it feel good? Like, does it feel pleasurable or pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? And if I bring a firmer pressure, is that more pleasant, less pleasant, or still neutral? And so giving ourselves this range and this language of communication to have with our bodies around the sensual, around the pleasurable, or unpleasant, pleasurable, painful, and that neither one is good or bad, right or wrong. It's just data. It's actually just a way of being in relationship, in more intimacy with our own bodily experience. Do I like this sound or not like this sound? Do I like this taste or not like this taste? And then it can lead to this, like, does this turn me on, not turn me on? Does this feel sexual, not feel sexual? Is this sexual experience pleasant or unpleasant? We start to be able to map these things together rather than having them all lumped together and trying to create language around like all of them all at once, sensual, pleasurable, sexual, all at once. But when we can tease them apart and create intimacy with ourselves around each part separately, then we begin to be able to have language for when they do come together. That this is a pleasurable sexual experience, or this is a pleasurable experience that's non-sexual, or this is a pleasurable non-sexual experience that I would like to bring into a sexual experience and make it sexual. That we begin to have language for ourselves, both verbal language and also sensory language, to describe our experience such as it is and such as we want it to be. Trying to just catch if there are last pieces. I know it's a lot, and it's somewhat, I don't know if I would call it circular. It's a little like spirally, kind of spirals in on itself. But I'm going to sign off in about a minute or two here. So if there are any questions or comments, now would be a great time. I'm just going to check if there was a last piece that I wanted to bring in. I think the main thing that I would leave with is really that inquiry in each layer. Like, what sensual experience am I having? That there is value, I think, in not assuming a sensual experience is pleasurable, but I do believe that there's also value in the willingness to go, well, what am I experiencing right now that is pleasurable? What do I see that's pleasurable to my sense of sight? What do I taste that's pleasurable to my sense of taste? What do I hear that's pleasurable? What do I sensorily or viscerally feel that is pleasurable? And there's often a lot happening that we wouldn't put in the realm of pleasurable. And also, most of us, or many of us, I would say, have some form of culture uh, that has led us to believe that what is pleasurable is sinful or bad or um, I don't know, wrong in some way. And so we'll turn away. It's easier to go when I ask people to feel like what's happening inside their body. Many people will find what doesn't feel good, what's tight, what's kinked, what's painful, and that there actually is value in our lives, not in avoidance of pain, like I don't want to feel that, but the willingness for periods of time to be able, right, to be both willing and have the capacity to turn our attention towards what feels good, what is pleasurable, what do I like about this moment, both at the sense of touch, right, the visceral sense, at in all of our senses, what is actually happening that feels good right now. That in itself will change your life. Not to only focus in a spiritual bypassy sort of way, like only, no, 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 I only want to see what's good, or I'm grateful for everything. Everything happens for a reason. There's no mistakes. But to say, like, yeah, you know what? Like, this doesn't feel good right now, but this does. In this moment, I don't like this, and I also like this. I may want to change this, but I can simultaneously actually feel some pleasure in my body right now, and that the two do not need to negate each other. And then I do think, because again, many of us have received from either our families or some sort of overculture the messages that sex itself maybe is bad, wrong, sinful, or it can only happen in certain ways. Definitely many people received that any sort of masturbation or solo sexual practice is bad and wrong. Many of us have taken that on, even if we don't believe that it's sinful. There's this little undercurrent of like, yeah, but if I had the right partner, I wouldn't have to do this. And when we say like have to do this, it's like, yeah, because this is like second rate or not as good as, or it's only because and so to broaden out to be like, well, where can I broaden into the realm of the sexual as well? That the sensual and the pleasurable, yes, absolutely find those outside of the sexual realm, but also where can I expand my capacity to experience the sexual outside of where I tend to habitually lump it. It only happens with someone of the opposite sex. It only happens with one person. It only happens if I'm partnered. It only happens with another person. It only happens, or it only should happen, or it can't happen, or these, whatever we think we boxed it in. Is there any way to expand that into what else can be sensual and pleasurable? And I would invite any of you to just take on an inquiry of if I distinguish these from each other, and if I start to bring more awareness to my sensual experience, to my pleasurable experience, to what is sexual for me in these distinguished ways, like how does that enrich my life? What else does this make possible for me? I hope it's helpful. I believe my experience, what I've seen with other people, and what I believe is that it actually allows us to have a richer, fuller, and more pleasurable life. It doesn't mean all our problems go away, that we never experience pain, or that we get everything we want all the time, but that it's like, oh, actually I experience my life. And this is true. It's like I experience my life as pleasurable most of the time, even when things that I don't like are happening. So I kind of wish that for everybody, honestly. Sending you so much love today. Ciao.